The summer of 1942 brought an unexpected sight to the battlefields of northern France. When German panzer crews first laid eyes on the British Churchill tank during the disastrous Dieppe raid on 19th of August, their initial response wasn't fear, it was laughter. Here was a tank that looked like it had rolled straight out of the First World War, lumbering along at a pace that made their Panzer IVs seem like racing cars by comparison. German after-action reports from Dieppe dripped with dismissive confidence. One tank commander described the Churchill as a mobile pillbox, and he didn't mean it as a compliment. The Germans had good reason for their contempt. Their intelligence had clocked the Churchill's top speed at roughly 15 miles per hour on roads, compared to their Panzer IV's sprightly 25 miles per hour. In the doctrine that had swept across Poland, France, and deep into Russia, speed was everything. The blitzkrieg depended on rapid penetration, encirclement, and keeping the enemy off balance. A tank that couldn't keep pace with an advancing column seemed not just obsolete, but actively dangerous to the crews forced to operate it. German tankers coined the nickname infantry panzer, infantry tank, and they spat the words with derision. The Churchill's appearance didn't help its reputation. With its tall, slab-sided hull and tracks that ran along the entire length of the chassis, it looked positively archaic next to the sleek, sloped armour of German designs. British tank designer Dr. H.E. Merritt had created something that seemed to reject every lesson of modern armoured warfare. Where German engineers obsessed over silhouette and deflection angles, the Churchill stood tall and proud, presenting a target that seemed custom-made for enemy gunners. Its main armament in early variants, a 2-pounder gun, was already obsolete by 1942 standards, incapable of penetrating the frontal armour of the newer German tanks it would face. At Dieppe, the Churchill's debut confirmed German prejudices. Of the 58 Churchills that landed on the beaches, not a single one made it off. Some bogged down in the shingle. Others were knocked out by German anti-tank guns that found the slow-moving targets almost insultingly easy to engage. The survivors were abandoned when the raid collapsed into chaos. German recovery teams towed away several intact Churchills for evaluation, and their reports reinforced the narrative. Here was a tank designed by a nation that didn't understand modern warfare. Wehrmacht technical bulletins circulated photographs of captured Churchills with annotations pointing out design flaws. The suspension system, they noted, was unnecessarily complex. The track design sacrificed speed for traction, a pointless trade-off when speed was paramount. Some German analysts even suggested the Churchill represented British desperation, a rushed design from a nation running out of ideas and resources. They weren't entirely wrong about the desperation part, but they'd missed something crucial. What German tankers didn't yet couldn't realize from the flat beaches of Dieppe, was that they'd only seen the Churchill in the one environment where it was genuinely outmatched. They'd evaluated a climbing tank on a beach. It was rather like judging a mountain goat's worth by watching it swim. The Churchill had been designed with a very specific capability in mind, one that seemed quaint and outdated to German eyes, accustomed to the wide open steppes of Russia and the desert flats of North Africa. But warfare, as both sides would soon discover, wasn't always conducted on terrain that favoured the swift. The Churchill's peculiar design makes perfect sense once you understand the terror that gripped Britain in June 1940. Dunkirk had just happened. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped by the skin of its teeth, but they'd left behind virtually every tank, vehicle, and heavy weapon they possessed on French soil. Britain now faced the very real prospect of German invasion with an army that had rifles and not much else. The War Office looked at their depleted tank force and made a decision born of pure panic. They needed a new heavy infantry tank, and they needed it immediately. The specifications drawn up in July 1940 reflected a very specific nightmare scenario. British military planners, many of whom were veterans of the First World War, convinced themselves that any German invasion would inevitably bog down into trench warfare. They envisioned fighting through a landscape of trenches, bunkers, and fortified positions, essentially 1918 all over again, but with the stakes infinitely higher. The tank they specified needed to cross wide trenches, climb steep obstacles, and provide mobile firepower for infantry assaults against entrenched positions. Speed was a secondary consideration. Climbing ability was paramount. Vauxhall Motors received the contract in July 1940 with an impossible deadline. First prototypes by the following year. The company's chief designer, with a team working around the clock, produced the initial designs in just 4 months. By June 1941, barely a year after the specification was issued, the first Churchill tanks rolled off production lines. This was lightning-fast development by any standard, but speed came at a cost. The Churchill that entered service was essentially a beta version pressed into production before proper testing could be completed. The mechanical problems began immediately. Early Churchills suffered from appalling reliability issues that made German mockery seem almost justified. The Merlin engine, adapted from Leyland bus engines, frequently overheated. The gearbox, a complex system designed to handle the tank's 40-ton weight, broke down with alarming regularity. Tracks threw themselves off the wheels. Electrical systems failed. Cooling systems leaked. During trials in 1941, some Churchills broke down before they'd even left the factory grounds. One internal report suggested that the average Churchill could barely manage 100 miles before requiring major mechanical attention. The troubles reached their peak in early 1942, when a parliamentary committee seriously considered cancelling the entire programme. The Churchill had consumed enormous resources Britain could scarcely afford, and delivered a tank that seemed to break down more often than it ran. Critics pointed out that the original specification, based on fears of trench warfare, now seemed absurdly outdated. The war had moved on. Battles were being fought in deserts and steppes, not trenches. Did Britain really need a slow, unreliable trench crosser when what they desperately needed were reliable tanks that could fight the Germans on equal terms? Winston Churchill himself, after whom the tank was named, though he'd had nothing to do with its design, nearly became its executioner. He detested the vehicle's early performance and made his feelings brutally clear in cabinet meetings. Only the intervention of several senior officers who saw potential in the basic design saved the programme. Vauxhall's engineers went back to work, systematically addressing each failure point. By mid-1942, the Churchill Memke III had resolved many of the worst reliability issues. The tank that landed at Dieppe, while still far from perfect, was at least mechanically sound enough to reach the battlefield. Whether it could prove its worth, there remained an open question that German contempt seemed to have answered decisively. The philosophical divide between German and British tank design ran deeper than mere engineering choices. German armoured doctrine, forged in the victories of 1939 through 1941, treated tanks as the tip of a mechanised spear. The panzer divisions weren't meant to fight other tanks if they could help it. That was a costly distraction. Their job was to punch through enemy lines, race into the rear areas, and create chaos faster than the enemy could respond. This required tanks that could cover ground quickly, strike hard, and keep moving. The Panzer IV, backbone of German armoured forces by 1942, could manage 25 miles per hour on roads and about 16 across country. Its later variants mounted the formidable long-barreled 75mm gun that could kill almost any Allied tank at range. The Churchill, by contrast, topped out at 15 miles per hour on roads under ideal conditions. Cross-country, it often slowed to a crawl that made infantrymen question whether they should just walk alongside it. German tank commanders who encountered Churchills in combat found them almost insultingly easy to outmaneuver. A Panzer could simply drive around a Churchill, position itself for a flank shot, and engage at leisure. The Churchill's turning circle was reasonable, but turning at 15 miles per hour hardly matters when your opponent is circling you at 20. In open terrain, the environment where most tank battles occurred, the Churchill was at a severe disadvantage against virtually any German armoured vehicle. But speed wasn't the Churchill's game. British designers had made a calculated trade-off, one that seemed baffling to German analysts, who examined captured examples. The Churchill's tracks extended along almost the entire length of its hull, creating a ground contact length of roughly 13 feet. Compare this to the Panzer IV's mere 11 feet, and you start to see a different design philosophy emerging. That extra track length distributed the Churchill's 40-ton weight over a much larger surface area, reducing ground pressure to about 14 pounds per square inch. The Panzer IV, despite weighing less, exerted nearly 16 pounds per square inch because its weight was concentrated over a smaller footprint. Ground pressure determines whether you sink or float, not just in mud, but on any surface that might give way. Lower ground pressure means better traction, less bogging down in soft terrain, and crucially, the ability to climb slopes where soil might otherwise give way beneath the tracks. The Churchill's designers had essentially built a tank that treated every surface it encountered as potentially treacherous ground. This seemed like over-engineering to German eyes. Why sacrifice speed and complicate your suspension system for slightly better traction? The answer lay in geography and mission. German tanks were designed for the vast spaces of Eastern Europe and the open deserts of North Africa, terrain where mobility was survival. British infantry tanks, a category the Churchill belonged to, were meant to support foot soldiers assaulting prepared positions. They needed to go wherever the infantry went, which often meant terrain where speed was physically impossible anyway. A tank designed to accompany men climbing a steep hillside doesn't need to be fast. It needs to be able to make the climb at all. German doctrine had no real equivalent to the infantry tank concept. Their closest analogue would be assault guns like the Stuka Thur, but even these prioritized mobility within their role. The idea of deliberately designing a slow tank seemed to violate the fundamental principles that had delivered victory after victory. Yet this doctrinal blind spot meant German engineers had never seriously grappled with the problem of extreme gradient climbing. Why would they? The tank battles that mattered, or so they believed, happened on terrain where their faster vehicles held every advantage. The physics of climbing a hill in a 40-ton steel box are more complex than they first appear. When a tank attempts to ascend a steep slope, three forces fight for dominance: the engine's power pushing it forward, gravity pulling it backward, and friction between the tracks and the ground, determining whether forward motion actually happens or whether the tracks simply spin uselessly. Get any one of these factors wrong, and your tank becomes a very expensive sledge sliding back down the hill. The Churchill's designers understood this equation intimately, even if their solution looked bizarre to conventional eyes. Track design matters more than most people realize. The Churchill's tracks featured a distinctive pattern with relatively wide, flat plates and aggressive cleats that bit into soft ground. Each track plate measured roughly 14 inches wide, spreading the tank's weight whilst providing multiple contact points for grip. But width alone doesn't tell the whole story. The Churchill used a two-pitch track system, essentially two different lengths of track plate alternating around the circumference. This created an uneven contact pattern that broke up the rhythm of potential slippage. When one section began to lose grip, another was already biting in. German tanks typically used single-pitched tracks that, whilst simpler to manufacture and maintain, created a more uniform and therefore more predictable slip pattern on difficult terrain. The suspension system was where the Churchill truly diverged from orthodox design. Most tanks of the era used variations of torsion bar or leaf spring suspension, systems that worked beautifully for absorbing the shock of high-speed cross-country movement. The Churchill employed something different, a coil spring suspension system with 11 small road wheels per side. This seemed needlessly complicated. More wheels meant more potential failure points, more maintenance, more weight. German engineers who examined captured Churchills remarked on this apparent over-engineering with bemused contempt. But those 11 small wheels weren't there for shock absorption. They were there to maintain constant track contact with the ground regardless of the terrain beneath them. As the Churchill climbed, each small wheel could independently conform to irregularities in the surface. Hit a boulder halfway up a slope, one or two wheels would rise to accommodate it, whilst the other 9 maintained pressure on the ground. This meant the track never lifted entirely off the surface, never lost that crucial friction that prevented backward sliding. Larger wheels, while simpler, created gaps in ground contact whenever they encountered obstacles, gaps that could prove fatal on a steep incline. The Churchill's centre of gravity sat unusually low for such a tall tank, positioned just 3 feet 6 inches above the ground, despite the hull standing over 8 feet high. This was achieved by mounting the engine low in the hull and keeping the turret relatively compact. A low centre of gravity reduces the moment force trying to tip the tank backward when climbing. The mathematical term is rotational torque, but practically it means the difference between climbing and flipping. German tanks designed for speed and profile often had higher centres of gravity that made them more susceptible to pitching backward on extreme slopes. Ground pressure calculations revealed the full picture. The Churchill's 14 pounds per square inch meant that on a 30-degree slope, the effective pressure at each contact point remained below the shear strength of most soil types. The tracks wouldn't break through the surface and cause that terrifying moment where the tank begins sliding despite the engine screaming at full power. A Panzer IV attempting the same slope would be right at the edge of its traction envelope, tracks churning through topsoil, trying to find purchase on something solid beneath. This wasn't theory. This was measurable, repeatable physics that was about to be demonstrated in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable, actual combat. Tunisia in early 1943 was nothing like the desert battlefields that had defined the North African campaign after the Anglo-American landings of Operation Torch in November 1942. The fighting had pushed eastward into a landscape of steep hills, narrow valleys, and terrain that turned the Desert Wars rulebook into wastepaper. The Dorsetshire Regiment discovered this reality on 27th of February 1943, during the fighting around Hunt's Gap in the Jebel El Amera Hills. They'd been tasked with taking a German position atop a ridge with slopes that looked vertical from the valley floor. Their supporting tanks, a troop of Churchill Mac III's from the North Irish Horse, were meant to provide covering fire from the base of the hill. Nobody expected them to actually climb it. The troop commander, faced with watching his infantry get cut to pieces or attempting something the manual probably said was impossible, chose the latter. The Churchills pivoted toward the slope and began their ascent. Witnesses described the angle as so steep that standing at the bottom you couldn't see the top of the tank, only its underside. The Churchills climbed in first gear, engines roaring, tracks clawing at rocky soil. German defenders atop the ridge initially ignored them. assuming they'd inevitably slide back or bog down. They didn't. 10 minutes of grinding ascent later, 3 Churchills crested the ridge directly into the German position. The defenders, who'd been confidently engaging the British infantry below, suddenly found themselves facing 40-ton steel boxes that had apparently defied gravity. The position was abandoned within minutes. Word of this impossible climb spread through both armies with the speed that only truly surprising battlefield events achieve. Within a week, similar reports emerged from engagements across the Tunisian hills. On 6th of March, during operations around Medjez el Bab, Churchill tanks of the 51st Royal Tank Regiment climbed slopes to support infantry assaulting German positions in the hills overlooking the Medjerda Valley. A captured German lieutenant, interrogated after the battle, expressed genuine bewilderment. His training had taught him to position anti-tank guns on hilltops because tanks couldn't reach them there. The Churchills had rendered this fundamental assumption obsolete. The fighting around the Kasserine Mountains, where American forces had been badly mauled by Rommel's counter-offensive in mid-February, offered the most dramatic vindication. British and Churchill tanks moved into the area in early March as part of the Allied regrouping. The Tobago Gap battles on 21's 22nd March saw Churchills operating in terrain that German planners had dismissed as impassable to armour. One particularly telling engagement involved a German observation post positioned on a hillside that surveyed the entire approach route. British intelligence knew about it. The solution was obvious to everyone except how to actually reach it. The slope was measured at 38 degrees, well beyond what any tank could manage, except the Churchill managed it. The observation post's final radio transmission reportedly consisted of panicked shouting about tanks appearing where tanks couldn't possibly be. German after-action reports from Tunisia began showing a marked shift in tone. The dismissive confidence of 1942 gave way to cautious respect, though some officers still clung to the narrative that the Churchill was fundamentally flawed. One report from March 1943 acknowledged the Churchill's unexpected climbing capability on steep gradients, but insisted this was of limited tactical value, since most engagements occurred on more favourable terrain. This was technically true, but missed the point entirely. The Churchill didn't need to outclimb Panzers on every battlefield. It only needed to outclimb them when hills mattered. And in Tunisia's mountains, hills mattered enormously. By April 1943, as the Tunisian campaign ground toward its conclusion, with the Axis forces trapped against the sea, German tactical bulletins had begun advising units to avoid positioning themselves on hilltops when Churchills were known to be operating in the sector. This was a remarkable reversal. The tank they'd mocked at Dieppe had forced the Wehrmacht to change its defensive doctrine. The slow, obsolete infantry tank had found its battlefield, and on that battlefield, speed mattered far less than the ability to go where your enemy believed you couldn't. Tunisia proved to be merely the rehearsal. When Allied forces stormed ashore in Sicily on 10th of July 1943, the Churchill crews of the 25th Army Tank Brigade knew exactly what awaited them: more mountains. Sicily's interior is a fortress of steep volcanic hillsides and ancient stone villages perched on slopes that seem designed to mock armoured warfare. The American Sherman tanks, which had performed admirably in North Africa's open spaces, found themselves stymied by gradients that turned their reliable engines into liabilities. A Sherman could manage perhaps 30 degrees under ideal conditions before its tracks began losing purchase. Sicily's hills frequently exceeded that, and ideal conditions were in short supply. The fighting around Centurepe in early August 1943 showcased the Churchill's capabilities in ways that made Tunisia look modest. Centurepe sits atop a mountain ridge with approaches that German defenders considered tank-proof. The Churchills of the Canadian Army's Three Rivers Regiment proved them catastrophically wrong on 2nd August, climbing access roads with gradients that engineers later measured at 42 degrees. The German defenders, positioned to repel infantry with clear fields of fire down the slopes, found themselves engaged at point-blank range by tanks that had somehow ascended what were essentially goat tracks. The town fell the same day. The Italian mainland campaign, beginning with the Salerno landings on 9th of September 1943, transformed the Churchill from a useful specialist into an indispensable weapon. Italy's spine is the Apennine mountain chain running the length of the peninsula like a geological obstacle course specifically designed to frustrate military planners. Every river valley led to ridges. Every ridge concealed another ridge behind it, and the Germans, masters of defensive warfare, fortified them all. The Gustav Line, the Hitler Line, the Gothic Line, each successive defensive position made brilliant use of terrain that favoured the defender. Attacking uphill into prepared positions is every infantryman's nightmare unless you can bring your firepower with you. The Churchill could bring firepower. At Monte Cassino, during the agonising battles that stretched from January through May 1944, Churchills operated in conditions that would have been inconceivable to pre-war tank designers. The slopes around the monastery weren't just steep, they were often covered in rubble from artillery bombardment, creating unstable surfaces where every metre gained could be lost to a sudden slide backward. Yet Churchills equipped with 75 mm guns, a significant improvement over the original 2-pounders, crawled up these nightmarish inclines to provide direct fire support for assaulting infantry. A Canadian tanker later recalled watching his track commander guide their Churchill up a slope where loose rocks cascaded down past their hull with every movement, the engine screaming in first gear, the entire crew convinced they'd pitch backward at any moment. They reached the top. By the Gothic line battles of autumn 1944, the Churchill had become the tank of choice for mountain operations. British and Canadian infantry units specifically requested Churchill support when facing hillside assaults. The numbers tell the story. During operations in the northern Apennines in September and October 1944, Churchill tanks successfully operated on gradients that averaged 38 degrees, with several documented instances of climbs exceeding 45 degrees. For context, a 45-degree slope means you're climbing 1 metre for every metre you move forward. Standing at the bottom, you're looking almost straight up at the top. German Panzer IVs and Panthers, when captured examples were tested on similar terrain by British evaluators, consistently failed at anything beyond 35 degrees, their tracks breaking loose and spinning uselessly. The German forces in Italy learned to adapt their tactics around the Churchill's abilities. Defensive positions that would have been tank-proof against any other Allied armour now required additional anti-tank guns positioned to cover approach routes that shouldn't have needed covering. Every hilltop became vulnerable. The psychological impact was significant. German infantry defending mountain positions could no longer count on terrain alone to protect them from armoured assault. The Churchill that climbed Italian mountains in 1944 bore little resemblance to the mechanically troubled vehicle that had landed at Dieppe 2 years earlier. Vauxhall's engineers had been busy, systematically addressing every complaint whilst fiercely protecting the design features that made the Churchill unique. The Churchill Mencke III, which entered service in March 1942, replaced the obsolete 2-pounder with a 6-pounder gun that could actually threaten German tanks. More importantly, the reliability issues that had plagued early models were methodically eliminated. The gearbox was redesigned, the cooling system overhauled, and the electrical gremlins hunted down and exterminated. The Mk4, introduced in late 1942, was essentially a Mencke III built with cheaper cast components rather than welded plates, a manufacturing decision that actually improved protection in many areas whilst speeding up production. By early 1943, when Churchills were proving themselves in Tunisia, the production line was delivering tanks that could reliably complete their missions without breaking down halfway through. This sounds like a low bar, but reliability is the foundation upon which everything else is built. A brilliantly designed tank that won't start is just an expensive pillbox. The real transformation came with the Churchill Magda 7, which began reaching units in October 1944. Here was a vehicle that retained every climbing advantage of the original whilst addressing the two complaints that had dogged the design since Dieppe: inadequate armour and insufficient firepower. The MK7's frontal armour measured 152 mm thick, substantially better than the MK3's 102 mm, and nearly equivalent to the German Tiger I's frontal protection. The 75 mm gun, whilst not as powerful as the German long-barreled 75 mm, was adequate for engaging most targets the Churchill would encounter. Crucially, the weight increase from these improvements, the MK7 tipped the scales at 41 tons, barely affected the climbing performance. The suspension handled the extra ton without complaint, and the ground pressure remained low enough to maintain that crucial traction advantage. German intelligence reports from late 1944 show a remarkable evolution in assessment. A captured Wehrmacht tactical bulletin from November 1944, circulated to units in Italy, advised that the British Churchill heavy tank should be engaged at maximum range whenever possible, and that previously reliable hilltop defensive positions may not provide adequate protection against this vehicle. The word heavy is telling. German classifications had initially dismissed the Churchill as a medium tank, despite its weight. The reclassification reflected a new understanding that the Churchill was a genuinely formidable opponent when employed correctly. Individual German tankers began expressing grudging respect, though often couched in the language of professional rivalry. A Panther tank commander, captured near Bologna in April 1945, admitted during interrogation that the Churchill is nearly impossible to stop on rising ground, and that attempting to pursue one uphill is inadvisable. This from a man whose Panther mounted a 75mm gun that could penetrate the Churchill's side armour with ease in a fair fight. But fights on Italian hillsides weren't fair, and the Churchill's ability to dictate engagement angles on sloped terrain neutralised many of the Panther's advantages. The specialised variants proved the design's versatility. The Churchill AVRE, Armoured Vehicle Royal Engineers, carried a 290mm petard spigot mortar for demolishing fortifications and could still climb slopes that stopped conventional tanks. Churchill Crocodiles, equipped with flamethrowers, terrified German defenders in Italian mountain villages where the narrow streets and steep approaches made conventional assault suicidal. These variants succeeded because the base chassis could go places other tank chassis simply couldn't reach. By 1945, the vehicle that German tankers had mocked 3 years earlier had earned a reputation as one of the most tactically flexible tanks in the Allied arsenal, not despite its peculiar design philosophy, but precisely because of it. By the time Germany surrendered on 8th of May 1945, the Churchill had participated in every major campaign from Tunisia to the Rhine. More than 5,600 had been produced, and they'd served with British, Canadian, Australian, and even Soviet forces under Lend-Lease arrangements. The tank that parliamentary committees had nearly cancelled in 1942 had become one of Britain's most successful armoured vehicles of the war. But perhaps the most telling vindication came not from Allied sources, but from the ultimate authority on whether a weapon system works. The enemy stopped underestimating it. Post-war assessments revealed the full extent of the Churchill's impact on German tactical thinking. When American forces captured German training facilities in 1945, they discovered updated tank identification manuals that devoted considerable space to the Churchill, including specific warnings about its climbing capabilities and recommendations for engagement. The vehicle, dismissed as obsolete in 1942, had forced one of the world's most professional military organizations to rewrite its doctrine. That's not a small achievement. The Churchill's service didn't end with victory in Europe. When the Korean War erupted on 25th of June 1950, Churchill tanks of the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars found themselves fighting in mountainous terrain that could have been purpose-designed to showcase their abilities. The Korean peninsula's ridgelines and steep valleys proved remarkably similar to Italy's mountains. North Korean T-34-85 tanks, excellent vehicles in their own right, discovered what German Panzers had learned years earlier. Speed means nothing when you can't reach the battlefield. Churchills climbed to positions that supported Commonwealth infantry assaults throughout 1951 and 1952. Their wide tracks and low ground pressure handling Korean hillsides with the same competence they'd shown in the Apennines. The Churchill Crocodile saw action at Hill 227 in November 1951, where its flame projector cleared bunker complexes on slopes exceeding 40 degrees. An American liaison officer, accustomed to the excellent but more conventionally designed M4 Sherman, filed a report expressing astonishment that the British were still operating those museum pieces and grudging admiration that the old girls can still climb like mountain goats. The museum pieces would remain in active service until 1952, outlasting many tanks that had been designed to replace them. What made the Churchill a legend wasn't its speed or its firepower. Both remained adequate at best throughout its service life. What made it legendary was that it solved a problem most tank designers had ignored because they'd convinced themselves it didn't matter. Hills exist, mountains exist, urban rubble exists, mud exists. Designing a tank that goes fast on good terrain is relatively straightforward. Designing one that goes anywhere the infantry needs it, regardless of terrain, requires different thinking. The Churchill's designers had that different thinking, even if contemporary observers mistook it for incompetence. The broader lesson transcended tank design. Engineering isn't about creating the theoretically optimal solution. It's about solving actual problems in actual conditions. German tanks were masterpieces of engineering that excelled in environments that favoured their strengths. The Churchill was a masterpiece of engineering that excelled despite operating in environments that exposed everyone else's weaknesses. When you're climbing a 40 degrees slope under fire, the theoretical superiority of your opponent's speed and firepower becomes rather academic. The last Churchills were finally retired from British service in 1952, though some soldiered on with the Irish Army until 1969. From 1940's panic-driven specification to 3 decades of service across 4 continents, the tank nobody wanted had proved that sometimes the experts get it wrong. Sometimes the laugh is on the mockers. Sometimes slow and steady really does win the race, especially when the race goes uphill.